Welcome to the World Leaders Forum. I'd like to recognize a few people at the beginning. Of course, the President of Iraq, Barham Salih, and the First Lady of Iraq, Dr. Sarbig Salih, and their family who is here with us this morning. I'd like to recognize also members of the Iraqi delegation, Daniel Shapiro, former ambassador of the United States to Israel, our moderator, Safwan Masri, who is Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, and our co-sponsor, the Columbia Global Centers, and the many students and faculty who have joined us this morning. For generations of Americans, the idea of Iraq looms large. It is the country we invaded twice, once during the Gulf War and again more than a decade later. That second invasion and subsequent occupation ousted authoritarian leader Saddam Hussein and kicked off nearly 9 years of United States combat operations in the country. During that time, Iraq was known as an unstable place, where sectarian violence flourished and people feared for their lives on a daily basis. Politicians struggled to govern, plagued by warring factions and corruption. The rise of the Islamic State and the devastation it caused led to a resurgence of American military engagement and interest in the country in 2014. Characterized by images of horrific violence inflicted on men, women, and children. Today, Iraqis are trying to turn the page. More than 15 years after the American invasion, the country is beginning to move on, to rebuild what was destroyed, to try to give democracy a real chance to take root. Sectarian violence has lessened. Politicians are able to focus on prosaic concerns like public services, unemployment, and infrastructure. When the 2018 elections ended in a deadlock, a coalition government took over, warding off violent upheaval and restoring order to the country. The Iraqi people would be the first to acknowledge that the road ahead is difficult and uncertain. The oil-dependent economy is struggling. Ethnic conflict remains a constant threat. Fears of a resurgent Islamic State linger, and for good reason. We are joined this morning by someone who can help us understand Iraq as it is today, President Salih. In a life that has taken many twists and turns, the president has distinguished himself as a principled and thoughtful leader. He's been an engineer, a dissident, a politician, and a university founder. He has devoted himself to public service, admired for his tireless work ethic and deep love of his country. Skillful, moderate, and non-sectarian, he enjoys the confidence of all the major political factions in Iraq, a rare feat in a deeply divided nation. Born in Iraqi Kurdistan, President Salih became politically active at a young age, running afoul of Saddam Hussein's totalitarian regime at the age of 19. He was arrested twice, detained, and tortured. He went to Great Britain, where he earned a civil engineering degree from the University of Cardiff and a doctorate in engineering from the University of Liverpool. From abroad, he continued his political involvement, working in the United States as the Iraqi Kurds representative in Washington, D.C. Following the invasion of Iraq, he returned home. He joined the interim government as Deputy Prime Minister, eager to help his country transition to a democracy. In 2009, he was asked by the Kurdish government to join Kurdish leadership to join their government, and he served as Prime Minister of the Iraqi Kurdish region and Prime Minister of the Kurdish regional government. He developed a reputation as a reformer, as someone who is committed to democracy and prioritized issues like human rights, fair elections, and the empowerment of women. He founded the American University of Iraq and offered support to budding NGOs and civic institutions. In 2018, he was elected president by Parliament and shares power with the Speaker of Parliament and the Prime Minister. Please join me in welcoming President Salih.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this wonderful introduction, and it's truly an honor for me to be invited to Colombia. I was telling the President the first time I came here was in 1991 to come and meet with a professor, his name Andrew Bartoli. He used to be in charge of a conflict resolution program. And I came to see him seeking his assistance to launch a workshop in Kurdistan to help us overcome some of the difficult issues at the time. Since then, I became a frequent visitor to this place. I do see many, many friends, of course, Safwan, Masri, a good friend, David Phillips, who have also worked with us over the years on issues pertaining to Iraq and the Kurdistan region. And I have a family connection to this institution too as well. Our son has been to this university and graduated from this fine institution. I will talk to you about Iraq, and I will talk to you as the wider region too as well, because it's almost impossible to talk about Iraq in isolation of its neighborhood. But as the President has mentioned, there seems to be progress in Iraq, and perhaps a proof of that, Iraq is no longer in the headlines as much as it used to be. I was telling the United Nations General Assembly yesterday, it's important to put things in context when it comes to Iraqi transition. This is a country that has been through 40 years of conflict, unrelenting conflict. 2-3 days ago was the 39th anniversary of the onset of the Iraq-Iran war. Iraq-Iran war, 1991 invasion of Kuwait, sanctions, 2003, and waves after waves of terrorism sweeping our land and devastating our country. Not to mention the horrendous calamity that dictatorship has brought upon Iraq, the war of genocide, the use of internationally banned chemical weapons, the mass graves, and violent human rights abuses against the people of Iraq. This is a country that has been traumatized, and really, probably no other country has gone through what Iraq has been through for such an extended period of time. So I always ask our friends and observers of Iraqi scenes to put developments in the country in this important context. One cannot be too judgmental about the situation in a country like Iraq. But one thing for sure, after the defeat of ISIS, the territorial defeat of ISIS, the military defeat of ISIS, there is renewed hope for Iraq. There are important developments. Security is becoming more and more assured. The economy is becoming more and more active, and there is a growing sense of confidence among the Iraqi population across the country that the future could be better. There were moments in Iraqi transition where people were in despair, then the outlook seemed to be very, very grim. I can tell you, coming from Baghdad, despite the many challenges that remain, there is a sense that this country is moving in the right direction, and there is a trajectory of hope, a trajectory of positive developments. I was telling an American ambassador who was visiting with me yesterday, who served in Iraq, I was telling him Had this situation been in Baghdad 2 years ago, when you were around, you would have celebrated this as a spectacular success. Yet, people are shy from designating it so, perhaps for a number of reasons, one of which could be the regional dynamics with Iran and other issues. But one thing for sure, Iraq is emerging from decades of war. Iraq is emerging from decades of conflict, and we have some ambitious plans to making sure that our future is different from our past. I want to say the defeat of ISIS was quite significant. Only a few years back, 1/3 of the country was under the control of these terrorists. They were terrorizing the population of Iraq, and they were posing a threat to the international community as a whole. Iraq is largely free from these terrorists. This was a significant achievement and would not have been possible without a real commitment by Iraqis across the political divide. Different Iraqi communities, Arabs, Kurds, Shias, Sunnis, Turkmens, Christians, Muslims, coming together really in the fight against these terrorists. And it would not have been possible without the support of the international coalition led by the United States. And that contribution is highly appreciated as well. But the real sacrifice, the real commitment came from Iraq, and I think Iraqis served the nation well as the international community, by really being in the forefront in this fight. My message to the international community and to our American friends, the territorial defeat of ISIS, the military defeat of ISIS is very significant. We need to cherish it, we need to protect it, but we should not be complacent about it. Military defeat of ISIS is important, but definitely not adequate. And we have seen this movie before. When you defeat an insurgency, when you defeat a terrorist onslaught, only to relax and to be revisited by another manifestation, by another mutant of these extremist groups. I worry that the incubating environment for extremism and terrorism across the Middle East is still there. We need to do a lot more than just territorially and militarily defeating ISIS. First and foremost, the regional dynamics is broken. There remains to be significant presence of terrorist bases and terrorist elements in Syria and many other countries around the Middle East. There remains to be a number of ISIS remnants roaming across the borders of Iraq and Syria that needs to be taken care of. We need a new regional order that really should be based on combating extremism and terrorism and should not allow terrorism to be used as a tool of policy for one country against another. And if we're not careful, these remnants with these bases or presence across the region could really forge into another mutant that can haunt us and make life difficult, not just for the Iraqi people or the Syrian people, but across the world too as well. But there is more. Terrorism and extremism does not come from a vacuum. It comes from collapsed systems of government. It comes from collapsed systems of education, hopelessness, and lack of job opportunities for the young people. In the case of Iraq, I explained to you 40 years of devastation, 40 years of conflict, and yes, the significance of the moment of taking on ISIS and defeating it militarily is not lost upon us, but we have a 38 million population, almost 70% of whom are below the age of 30. And they are seeking jobs. They are seeking opportunities to contribute to their societies. So we need fundamental economic reforms, restructuring of our economy, empowering the private sector, and making sure that our kids have job opportunities. What is true in this country is also true in Iraq. Our people seek job opportunities, seek services, seek dignity. Reforming our political system, reforming our economic dynamics, and making sure our younger population in particular have job opportunities in the future is important. To this end as well, is vital to reforming our education sector. I passionately care about this issue of education. Iraq in the 1950s and 60s used to be in the forefront of education across the Middle East. Safwan was reminding me that people from Jordan, the Gulf, elsewhere in the Middle East would come to the University of Baghdad to be educated. Yet now, our education sector, our health sector are very much behind the rest of the world. And we do need to reform our education system and making sure our universities are able to empower our younger generation to compete in this new world. This is a monumental task. It's a lot easier said than done. The President was gracious to refer to my contribution for founding an American university in Sulaymaniyah, and I was saying to the President, many people would disagree about this aspect or that of American foreign policy, but almost there is world recognition that American education is among the best, if not the best, in the world. And Iraqis also aspire to this style of education. And we have launched this American university in my hometown, and they are like you, the kids who go there, the young people who go there. Sorry if I refer to you as kids, I mean, my daughter often, I still tell my daughter, kid, and she's 30. Am I allowed to say your age, Carla? And, they have the same aspirations as you. They want to be contributing to the future of the country, to the families, and to really make a quality life for their own families and for their own children and move on. And this is an area where the Middle East, generally speaking, needs to focus a lot on. And certainly Iraq, with its centrality, matters. But these things, again, are easier said than done. Overcoming the legacy of war, overcoming the legacy of bureaucracy, overcoming the impediment of corruption, which is a major, major issue in these societies that are emergent from conflict, is really monumental. So I urge you to consider the developments and the progress that we're making in our country in the context of these challenges that we deal with. Yesterday in the United Nations, I called for defeating terrorism requires an international coalition to combating corruption and combating terrorist financing. Many people are focused on the military aspect, security aspect of combating extremism, but remember, the political economy of conflict is corruption. This is what sustains terrorism, and this is what allows for the reinvention of terrorist movements across our part of the world. And this cannot be done just by the countries of the region who are locked in this battle day in, day out. This has to be a regional as well as an international responsibility. And I hope the vigor that we have witnessed from the international community in terms of fighting terrorism militarily will also be combined by active measures to make sure that terrorist financing and corruption are combated on a global level, because without it, we will continue to be in the same cycle. I'll come to the neighborhood too as well. Mesopotamia is quite an interesting region. Its geopolitics is defining political balances and regional balances. For millennia, Anatolia, Persia, and Arabia have collided in Mesopotamia, and this is what has always been the catalyst for defining the regional order. And we can go on and on depicting and telling stories about how Mesopotamia has been the place. Today, Iraq is at the heart of the region. The consequences of Iraq's developments and transition matters to the rest of our neighborhood, and the rest of our neighborhood is also of consequence to us. We are not an island in the Pacific, therefore we are affected by what is going on around us. I've been going around at the United Nations, meeting with world leaders, reaffirming to them the last thing this neighborhood needs is another war, especially as the last war against terror is yet to be definitively over. This neighborhood, the Middle East, generally speaking, could be the last major region that remains broken in the world. I'd say in the early part of the 20th century, Europe has suffered 2 major world wars. It was fixed. East Asia in the 1960s and 70s, it was largely fixed. Latin America in the 1980s, largely fixed. The world and our peoples have been condemned to this unrelenting cycle of trouble emanating from the Middle East for a whole host of reasons. It's time we really had a look about how to change the dynamics of this neighborhood. I tend to believe that Iraq will have an important role in that mission. Iraq, over the years, has been a domain when every neighbor and most of the international powers have really competed and fought through Iraqis, on Iraqi soil, advancing different agendas. Iraq became a source of trouble, became a source of instability across the neighborhood, but essentially the absence of Iraq from the neighborhood was also quite a profound statement why this region could never be brought back together. The vision that we are proposing, the vision that we are promoting, we say that Iraq, because of its geography, Iraq, because of its makeup, Arabs, Kurds, Christians, Muslims, Turkmens, Yazidis, you name it. It is the place where the fundamental communities of that neighborhood are coming together. And if we were to take a page from other parts of the world, where basically the political rivalries, competitions were replaced by notions of economic integration and interdependency, if it were true in elsewhere, there is no reason why this cannot be true in the case of the Middle East too as well. We did not have had world wars in the Middle East. I mean, it's important. The rhetoric in the Middle East is very violent, yes, I agree with you. But in reality, if you look at the context of conflicts in the Middle East, we're not on the scale of what other parts of the world have witnessed. And if we were able to transform and change the narrative from this political arguments and competition and these conflicts to one of economic competition and economic integration, I think the Middle East will be in a much, much better shape. We are now proposing in Iraq the setting up of a major reconstruction fund with 5% of Iraqi revenues being devoted to it, but enabling foreign direct investment to come to Iraq and bypassing some of the bureaucratic impediments that we have had before. Focus on infrastructure, focus on building railways, highways, airports, industrial zones, education cities, hopefully. Basically to really create conditions for Iraqi unity within, but also trans-regional projects. We are working on developing our export capacities, not only through Turkey, but also through Jordan, through other countries in the Middle East, creating that dependency, creating integrated energy supply lines, whether electricity or gas, and so on. Imagine if this were to become true, that Iraq with its geography, a place that has been the domain of conflict and competition of regional actors over the years, to become the bridge, the hub that can combine the economies of these different countries and really change the narrative to one of creating jobs, competing for opportunities, economic progress, and also making sure that this will be the norm of our relations. I know this defies logic, especially at this time when you have so much talk of war, so much talk of tension, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, you name it. But I think the very fact that we have this very, very serious escalation in the Middle East today, making a stir into the abyss of yet another devastating conflict that will be really damaging and catastrophic for the entire region and the world at large, I would say this is the moment to really think of what the alternative could be. The alternative has to be economic integration, has to be a focus on our younger generation, creating jobs, improving our education sector, improving our health sector, improving the quality of life for our citizens, so that the Middle East is not defined by terrorism, so that the Middle East is not defined by immigrants trying to knock on the doors of Europe, fleeing their countries and fleeing the wonderful culture of our nations and leaving the miseries behind them. The Middle East has the resources, natural resources, has the people, the quality of people and talent that can make that difference. We look to the international community and certainly to the United States to be helpful in that vision. Iraq can do it. Iraq is intent on doing it. And hopefully, before long, I could come back and the president could invite me and I can tell you even better news than what we are hoping for. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
President Saleh, thank you very, very, very much. This certainly gives us a wonderful, wonderful hope for Iraq and for the region. I do want to underscore, for those who do not necessarily know, that when President Saleh was elected by Parliament to lead the country, he got 219 out of the 273 votes that were cast for president. And the reason, and those votes came from all corners. You spoke about the diversity of Iraqi society. It is perhaps the most diverse, not perhaps, definitely the most diverse, I think, in the entire region. And your votes came from all corners. And when I talk to people in Iraq and people who know the situation very well, they all refer to you as a unifier, as somebody whom everybody looks to. In March of this year, in an interview with Washington Post, you noted that normalcy is coming back to Iraq, and you alluded to that over here. You also talked about the window of opportunity that's precious but precarious. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that moment, and how are you taking advantage of it? How are you looking to unify the diverse populations of Iraq? And their diversity and the divisions happen across all lines, right? Sectarian, geographic, ethnic, income, and so on. So how are you approaching this? Would you say that this is the toughest challenge, perhaps?
It is a tough challenge, undeniably so. But again, I want to put everything in context. The stability, the relative stability that Iraq is witnessing today is valued by most Iraqis because they have been through so much trouble over the past years. And my assessment is that most Iraqi citizens are adamant not to go back to the state of conflict and rivalry. They do see that their priorities, the priorities of the government, must be services, must be combating corruption, must be providing for a better education system, and also, by the way, emphatic that Iraq should not be embroiled in another conflict. And this is not easy, given the regional dynamics and its implications to Iraqi politics and Iraqi decision-making. So in a way, the leadership of the country is aware of the moment. The Prime Minister, the Speaker of Parliament, myself, and other major political leaders whom I convene at the Presidential Palace every so often are aware of the significance of this moment, that this relative success, this relative stability, and I'm using my words carefully, is precarious. We cannot take it for granted, but it is so precious. And the memories of our recent past are so vivid that no one wants to go back to. Obviously, there are extremist elements. There are rogue elements who would not care about it. But this is the kind of challenge we have to fight day in and day out in our society. My role as president, I'm obligated by the Constitution to be the symbol of the unity of the country. And the unity of the country does not come through the usual notions of unity in the Middle East. Unity comes through acknowledgement of diversity in our society. Iraq is a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian, multi-religious society in the truest sense of the word. And acknowledging that diversity is very important. And I dare say, throughout Iraqi history, this diversity has been accepted by the population. It was political elites, it was the dictatorship that violated that. But on a societal level, it has been like that
for millennia among the population. You never had civil wars in that context that you have witnessed perhaps in other societies. It was political conflicts between movements and so on, but never degenerated on a societal level, even at the height of the sectarian conflict in Iraq.
Right.
It really, in terms of scientific way of looking at it, did not turn into a civil war. The Marja'iyya in Najaf, the mainstream Sunni religious clergy, the main political leaders of the country all called for staying away from this turning into a sectarian conflict on a civil level.
So let's take that step forward and talk about security, and specifically about the role of the militias, right? So you have the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are not the army, the 140,000 person strong, acknowledged by the state. Actually, in your latest budget, I think you've allocated more than $2 billion to them. This is a diverse militia also. It's mostly Shia, but it has Sunni, it has Christian, and I think some Kurdish elements in it, perhaps less so because of the Peshmerga, about 30 groups. The loyalties are both Iraqi and Iranian, right? So they're, the question is, and this is partially courtesy of our common friend Juan Taha, okay, are we seeing the Lebanonization of Iraq? Are we seeing in the PMF something akin to Hezbollah, which has grown to being far more than a militia, right? It has control to a large extent over parliament. It provides social services. It provides everything and is in business.
The PMF, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, this is a force that came into being once ISIS swept through Iraq. And it came as a result of a fatwa by Ayatollah Sistani, calling for arms to fight ISIS. And had it not been for that fatwa, ISIS might have been able to come through Baghdad too as well. So it's very important to understand the dynamics, how this started, and when the war against ISIS ended, the challenge of regularizing and making sure that these groups are brought under state control has begun. Recently, our Prime Minister has issued a decree basically making sure that the structure of these entities are defined, their financing is defined, but also above all that they will be put under the command and control of the state and commanded by our Commander-in-Chief. I'm not one of those who say to you that this is done overnight. No, we do have elements that are defined that decree, and this is a state of transition. And when war happens, you deal with the legacies of it. But this is one of the important challenges of the Iraqi state, whether we as a state can be the sole controller of arms. This is the decision of the government. In every meeting we have with all the political leaders, some of them mean it more than others, have a commitment to this effect. Ayatollah Sistani himself or his representatives have adamantly asserted the need that the state should be the sole controller of arms. But obviously, there are elements who are defined that. In terms of loyalty between Iraq and Iran,
because some of them are loyal to Sistani, others are loyal to Khamenei. And
some, too, are loyal to, in terms of the Marja' al-Taqlid, go to Ayatollah Khamenei, but most to Ayatollah Sistani. This is a religious issue, but we're talking about the right to control arms. Right. This is a state issue, and this is the big challenge for the Iraqi state. If we don't do this thing, Iraqi state is no longer. We are mindful of this challenge, we're mindful of this responsibility, and we're not shying away from it. And I think the fact that we are getting pushback by some on the implementation of the decision of the government shows that the decision is serious. And but this is work in progress. We're working with the political leadership of the country to making sure that this decision is made. Now we are also working with the Peshmerga forces to unify in Kurdistan, to come together and to become part of the General Command of Armed Forces, because at the end of the day, again, Iraq needs a unified security establishment commanded by the commander-in-chief in accordance with our constitution. The Peshmerga has, for example, its own unique history and its own unique situation defined by the constitution. The same for Hashd, the same for the Iraqi military. But it is work in progress, and it is a challenge, and we need to do it. And if we don't do it definitively, I don't want to use the word Lebanization. It will be chaos, and Iraqi state, all the vision and the hope that we will have for our country will not be there.
يعطيك العافية. So I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts, but while I do that, if I can ask any students who want to ask questions, there are 2 standing microphones on either end, and if you can line up in front of them, and when I call on you, if you could introduce yourself quickly and ask a quick question, and make sure that there's a question mark at the end of it. Thank you, Barham, for your answer. I think you know, a lot of people, and we spoke earlier about spin, have talked about Hezbollah as a model, and they've looked at similarities. But it's very gratifying to hear you say.
Let me answer this.
You're bucking that.
The difference between Lebanon and Iraq, if one were to talk in those terms, Shias are the majorities in Iraq.
Right.
And the prime minister is Shia, the commander-in-chief in Shia. So you don't need a force outside the state to do that, in a sense, if one were to talk about the Lebanon model. I mean, again, it's an important challenge, it's an important responsibility of state to assert its control over arms and over military units. And this is work in progress, and this decree by the Prime Minister is significant, serious, and we have to, he is trying to enforce it, and we are enforcing it, but there is more work to be done.
Of course, and the challenge is that when a militia plays as important a role as the PMF did with ISIS, just like Hezbollah did with southern Lebanon and kicking Israel out of southern Lebanon, it emboldens.
But Safwan, we need to remember the days when ISIS were sweeping across. These young kids came in and fought for the country, and you simply just cannot ignore that reality, and you have to deal with it, and you have to accommodate them. But at the end of the day, rule of law, rule of the state, and this is the challenge, enforcing this in a truer sense of the word.
That's great.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Bren Flanagan. Your Excellency, thank you so much for being here. As an aspiring diplomat for the United States, I was curious if you could speak to how you see the U.S. supporting your government's efforts to continue to stabilize, not only domestically, but also in the region.
Barham, shall we take 2-3 questions at a time?
That will be good.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. President, Jonathan Craig. I served in the Army, still am. So I was in Iraq from 2007 to 2009, and then again in 2014.
Where in Iraq?
Just southeast of Sadr City, sir.
Oh.
New Baghdad area. So first, I wanted to say thank you very much for your support when you were Deputy Prime Minister during that time. It's greatly appreciated by us that served there. And then secondly, just in my time there, I know that the Iraqi people are an incredibly remarkable and very resilient people. So with the continued closing of the internally displaced persons camps and more families returning to their homes, how is the government satisfying the safety concerns for them as they may face reprisal from local security forces or attack by remaining insurgents?
Thank you. Take one more.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ziad, and I'm actually an Iraqi American. My question for you is, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, and it's more of a follow-up. There's a lot of Iraqi politicians who have competing alliances to foreign countries, whether that be Saudi Arabia or Iran. Muqtada al-Sadr was just there like last week or the week before. How do you balance these competing foreign interests as an Iraqi president when people are not necessarily first and foremost loyal to the state?
Great. You want to?
Okay, sure. United States matter, really, is of consequence. I mean, whether we like the policies or not, it matters and it affects our neighborhood. And I met with President Trump the day before yesterday. We had a very good exchange, and I was pleased to hear of his interest in Iraq and appreciating the progress that Iraq is making, and for the United States to remain engaged with Iraq to making sure that this progress is sustained and is nurtured. Obviously, the United States is a global power, has multifaceted relations with other countries, and it has to prioritize. My job as president of Iraq is to make sure that Iraq is a priority, and I'm telling everybody, our neighbors and the international actors, please, Iraq's success is real, precious, but precarious. Don't burden us with your priorities. Our priority is jobs for our kids, reforming the education system, and ensuring that terrorism does not revisit our country again. So this is a message we are adamant about, and I do also want to say is of importance to the neighborhood as a whole. Soon we will be convening, I hope, meetings of all the neighbors of Iraq in Baghdad, because all our neighbors from different vantage points assure us that they want the security and stability of Iraq to be sustained. At least they speak to us directly about this issue, and we want them to come to start a conversation in Baghdad about Iraq. I know there are other differences in the neighborhood between Saudis and the Iranians and other countries, but at the end of the day, if Iraq's sovereignty, if Iraq's stability is the common interest, let it be the starting point of a conversation between these competing powers, and hopefully we'll have a better Middle East with some kind of regional dialogue. Our friend who asked about the internally displaced people, in Anbar, Fallujah, those areas, almost, I would say, most of the internally displaced people have returned back. And if you come to Anbar now, you will see it reconstructed by and large after all the devastation that Anbar has gone through. Unfortunately, Mosul, I cannot say that about. Mosul, many of the refugees from Mosul, internally displaced people, are yet to go back. I think primary issue in these neighborhoods is the issue of services and rebuilding. And as a government, this is a major, major priority for us. And I hope the new budget, and we have our Minister of Planning with us, we will be going back on Saturday, and we have this active debate in Parliament. There should be enough in the budget to make sure that the repatriation of the internally displaced people and the reconstruction of places like Mosul will become a priority. When it comes to Iraqi politicians with connections to other countries, according to the Iraqi constitution, this should not be the case. According to Iraqi law, this should not be the case. It's troubling. But I tell you what also, the Iraqi opposition were mostly fighting Saddam Hussein from outside, some from Iran, some from Syria, some from Saudi Arabia, some from other European countries. And I don't want to pretend to you that this notion of Iraqi politicians and leaders to be totally immune from influences from other countries is not. But as Iraq develops, as Iraq's stability asserts itself, and as more national confidence is emerging, I do see this problem to be less of a problem. Iraq is an important country. Iraqi leaders or politicians should not feel themselves subjugated to others. Iraq is Mesopotamia. Iraq is where civilization was born. Iraq is a major, major power in that neighborhood. That self-confidence is re-emerging, and I hope that, with the rule of law, can deal with some of those manifestations.
Thank you. Okay, there are many of you in this limited time. You've been incredibly popular, Barham.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Alec. I do research up at the medical center, and I'd like to thank the president for coming to speak with us today. It's truly an honor to be able to ask you a question. And my question is about Kurdish politics. We saw in the 2018 elections that the KDP was fielding candidates for political positions traditionally reserved for PUK candidates. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, whether or not you think inter-Kurdish politics are becoming more unified or kind of backsliding. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
My name is Isaiah. My question involves ethnic minorities in Iraq. And to be clear, as an African American, I am not in a position to criticize race relations in any other country. But I would like to ask what the Iraqi government is doing to decrease stigmatization and discrimination, as well as increase adequate living conditions and access to higher education for Iraqis of African descent, particularly in the city of Basra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Reed Kessler. I'm studying human rights and international security. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It's a privilege for Columbia students to learn from world leaders. My question is on the United States intentionally targeting and destroying Iraq's water purification system in the Gulf War, followed by sanctions which prevented purification materials from restoring it, leading to immense suffering and an estimated 500,000 deaths of Iraqi children. This strategic decision directly violates the Geneva Conventions, especially Article 54, stating that it is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, crops, livestock, drinking water installations, and supplies and irrigation works. With the staggering number of civilian deaths, especially children, do you think that the U.S. should be held accountable and charged with war crimes? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take one more?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and if your question has been asked even in a different way, maybe you can give somebody else a chance. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Noah. I'm studying engineering here at Columbia, so I admire your engineering background. My question, you earlier mentioned that you see one of the main kind of roots of the terrorism in the region as being corruption. And so what do you see as your role, both domestically and in the region, in trying to prevent the corruption from being another starter of terrorism in the region?
Sure. The gentleman who asked me a question from the medical school talked about very specific, detailed issues of Kurdish politics. So, Mr. Bollinger, this tells you about the quality of American education. They know a lot. Obviously, Kurdish politics, like any other politics, has rivalries, and we have competing political parties. I happen to be in the PUK. My colleagues in the KDP were competing for the same post that I was aspiring to and fighting for. And we had a period of rough times, but I think now these problems have been put behind us. But nevertheless, there are different parties in Kurdistan, in Iraq, and they all, like you, by the way, like the United States, really. If anything, perhaps I dare say the level of rhetoric sometimes is less in Iraq than what you have in terms of the political discourse in the United States. I know you don't use car bombs, thank God, but I mean, hopefully we will never go back to those days when we would have civil war and so on. But again, political parties of different backgrounds, they compete for power, they seek their agendas. But the key is to making sure that this is done through parliamentary system. There was a period of time in which I competed with my colleagues across the political aisle. Now we are friends, and I'm sure a while from now we may be competing for different things and we will have the same problem, but important to keep it within the parliamentary system that we have accepted as the arbiter for our politics.
May I point to the fact that the mayor of Baghdad, the capital, is a woman? Mm-hmm. And with Tunis, those are the only two capitals now with with women mayors. And
if I may say something about Dr. Dekrat, she is the mayor of Baghdad, and hopefully very soon we will be launching together a piece of legislation to revive old Baghdad, that ancient city. And bring back some of the heritage sites of Baghdad and turn the center of Baghdad, downtown Baghdad, into a new culturally refined or protected development is something that I hope it won't be long before the president, and for that matter yourselves and Safwan, would be coming to see us in Baghdad and see the progress. I would say in this context, Beirut is an interesting example. Lebanese civil war was devastating, but Solidaire and the reconstruction of downtown, I know you disagree with the architecture, this is not what we're doing. No, but the reconstruction of Beirut was a defining end for the civil war. Imagine if we were to restore Baghdad's old town Baghdad, to its past glory. And I mean it, to the past glory, because the key is to making sure that this is not one of those developments that you and I don't like. the old Baghdad, and a place where we could celebrate the heritage of Baghdad, the culture of Baghdad, the history of Baghdad. And that, I hope, will be a defining statement about the end of conflict in the land of Mesopotamia. That is a dream that Zikra and I are working on, and I hope that we can do it and deliver it on it. Coming to corruption, corruption is truly the political economy of conflict. And the focus is often primarily on the issue of military and security aspects of combating extremism and terrorism. But this has become an industry in our part of the world. These conflicts are used to making a lot of money, and a lot of corrupt political elites are taking advantage of it. What to do about it is not easy, because corruption ends up being trickled down, goes to the media, goes to politics, goes to government, goes to almost every aspect of life. And it takes a lot of effort, and taking a page from American history as well. This has not been easy in this country as well. It took a long, long time. Right. But in our case, it is a matter of make or break. We have a number of arrangements within the Iraqi system to combat this. Some of us think that it is inadequate. We need to be much more forceful about it. And there is a lot of public support for it, I have to say. But this is a top priority. I personally think this cannot be done by any individual state per se. It has to be an international coalition, because often corrupt leaders or politicians or security officials get their money, take it out. Money laundering and all kinds of other stuff. So if the money comes to New York, the United States should be able to help a country like Iraq repatriate that money.
Yes, absolutely.
If it goes to London, if it goes to Istanbul, if it goes to Dubai, is not something that this ill-gotten money that goes to another country is a contribution to their economy and a loss to the original country. It is essentially part of the system of financing instability and financing conflict, which is becoming more costly, not just to countries like Iraq, is becoming far more costly to the rest of the world as well. That is why really working hard internationally, globally, to making sure that this is an international crime. It's not just an Iraqi crime. It's not just a local state crime. It's important.
The global banking system has a role in fighting that kind of corruption, and they have not listened to the occasion.
Absolutely. And if you look at numbers, and I cannot say for sure that these numbers are accurate or not, because you can get it from different angles and so on. They are staggering. What are taken out of countries, denying it to your education sector, your health sector, your societal development, and it's basically what sustains instability.
Yeah. So we have 7 minutes left, and I see 6 of you standing there. I'm not going to be able to get to all of you, but I'm going to ask you to be, we'll take as many as we can, and then His Excellency will be as crisp as possible, but just be very succinct and, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Emad Shahnushi. I'm an undergrad here, and I study the Middle East. And so I would like to thank you for being here today. It's truly an honor. My question is, how does the role of religious manager like Ayatollah Sistani influence the position of the Iraqi government in mobilizing people? Will it ever be possible to do so without this religious establishment?
Great. Go straight to the question.
Good morning. The global community appreciates your recent reparations bill for Yazidi female survivors of the most recent Yazidi genocide. How do you plan to expand the reparation for Yazidi victims who weren't necessarily abducted, as is stated in the bill? And what is the status?
Really important question.
Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to ask, my name is Margaret Billigveld, and I understand that you have recently formed your opposition party, the CDJ, and as you know, that this is a prominent phenomenon in the world, including in my country of Mongolia. What do you think are the conditions required for new parties to succeed?
Okay.
Shall we take? President.
Yeah.
I wanted to, you spoke so much about education. I wanted to hear from you, what do you think the government most needs in order to provide education for those who have been displaced? And as a researcher, what sort of data would be most useful for you? Thank you.
On the, on the Yazidi issue, the Yazidi community have suffered a terrible oppression, genocide. And Iraq and the international community, but certainly Iraq, because these crimes happened within our borders and our communities were affected, we are obligated to do as much as we can. And rest assured that not just myself, but others are keen, and we are obligated to do what is necessary for reparation, but also to really provide justice for the victims of these heinous crimes. On the role of Marja'iyya has been historically, not just during this period, has been crucial for moderation in Iraqi politics and has worked. And I remember, for example, Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim in the 1960s issued a fatwa saying it is haram to kill Kurds, to fight Kurds. So at historic junctures, Marja'iyya in Najaf has come along and provided a safety valve for politics and not to allow civil war and not to allow extremists to take the country.
Barham, imagine that it required the fatwa.
Yes, indeed, no. But this is, can I say something?
Yeah.
It's not, you and I both come from the Middle East, but in the Western world, religious authorities do have major influence, and one should appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And it's important. What Ayatollah Sistani has done after the transition in 2003 of bringing Iraqis together from different camps, averting, really, literally averting a major civil war after the attack on Samarra. These are historic moments that cannot be ignored. I have had the honor of meeting him a number of times. And, you know, the significant influence that he exercised without getting too involved in politics has been remarkable. During the war against ISIS, without his fatwa, perhaps Iraq would have been in really, really deep trouble. And the important thing about Najaf as well, Najaf calls for a civic state, does not call for a religious state. And this is very, very significant. And this has been historically the tradition of Marja'iyya in Najaf in terms of advocating in a multi-sectarian, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. This has been quite a powerful statement by Najaf. And I have been to Najaf a number of times. I was in the Vatican a while back and had an audience with His Holiness the Pope. I told him, this is Najaf, this is the Vatican with this beautiful architecture and this beautiful artwork. Our Vatican in Najaf has the beauty of Arab poetry and Arab literature that is one of the most beautiful manifestations of human creativity in a way. What was the last question that I was asked?
You addressed the Yazidi one, I think.
The Yazidi one, yes.
Okay, 5 seconds.
So in Iraqi Kurdistan, female genital mutilation and child marriage are extremely prevalent. Over 50% of women and girls in this region are victims of genital mutilation and 20% are victims of child marriage. What do you plan to do about that?
I was Prime Minister in Kurdistan region and we passed laws banning that. The statistics are alarming and I acknowledge that. It's a huge cultural and social problem. I know the Prime Minister of Kurdistan after me as well was very adamant about this issue, and the government, the KRG, has been really fighting this together with international organization, women activists. And the issue of women empowerment is very important in Iraq, in accordance with our constitution, so that, you know, 1/3 of our, 25% of our parliament are women. Regrettably, our cabinet in Baghdad does not have women ministers, by the way, so that, you know, I acknowledge that before I would be pointed out. But in the Kurdistan region, the first Speaker of Parliament is a woman. We have a number of women ministers. But these are societal changes that we need to deal with by law, by education, and really it's a big challenge, and it is a responsibility for the government and religious leaders and community leaders to take it on. And I think there is a lot of effort underway in that regard.
And you mentioned also reforms in terms of violence against women that are being introduced and for protection of women's sexual and other rights.
Sure. Actually, a week before I left to New York, I had the honor of submitting formally a draft legislation to combating domestic violence in Iraq. And we based this on the section in the Iraqi constitution, which is the Bill of Rights, which is quite an extensive and serious piece of legislation. And this will no doubt come across a lot of scrutiny in Iraqi parliament, because this is challenging some of accepted social norms and even some religious interpretations. But I hope with the help of different political leaders, we can do this thing. Again, these are issues that most societies in the Middle East have to deal with. We have to take it seriously. But now that we have defeated ISIS territorially, and I go back and say the challenges before us is dealing with these fundamental issues that define any society.
Great.
And I thank you for pointing out that question.
Yeah. So we are 50 seconds over time, but we can't allow the one last
Lady.
person
Indeed,
not to ask
please.
her question. Make it good and make it quick.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor. My name is Alexis Kanja. I'm a Chaldean American and in love with a country that I've yet to visit, so I hope in time that takes place. But with the opportunity to travel freely, I acknowledge that there are many that are not with that opportunity. And so with the country open to accepting deportees from the US and other countries, members of heavily persecuted Iraqi minority groups are now being transported against their will to the country. I'm interested in hearing one last perspective on this marginalization, and if the country is interested in understanding or putting in place humanitarian aid efforts that is existing to ease the assimilation. Many of these repatriations and deportees have never been to the Middle East or have navigated war-torn countries. I'd love to hear your opinion.
Obviously, we know about these recent repatriations, and I take your point that we need to be, as government, be ready to help. And I can promise you the following. When I go back, I will talk to the competent authorities about this. It is not on a scale that has commanded our attention, but I've read about it in the press, and including local press in Iraq. And it's not just Christians that are being sent back, others are also being. There were periods of time that was happening from Europe. People were being sent back, certainly to the Kurdistan region, and we had a number of programs to deal with their reintegration and jobs and so on. But I take your point. This is an important issue to look into.
Before I thank you, Barham, I just want to really thank the audience. It's been a great audience. The students, your questions are always so fantastic. So thank you for that. I want to thank President Bollinger for hosting this, for launching this incredibly important World Leaders Forum. No other university in the world does it as well as we do, and it's our president. It's Colombia. And I want to thank and acknowledge Dr. Sebag, the First Lady of Iraq. We didn't have a chance to talk about a number of things, including climate and water. She's an agriculturalist, and this is an area that she works on, and we hope to collaborate. But when we look at the Arab world, there's a dearth of leadership. I can say this, you cannot say that. It's very, very uncommon, it's very rare to have leadership that one can be inspired by, that one can aspire for the rest of the region for. You embody that, and I don't say that only because you are my friend and I have deep affection for you, but really because you've really raised the bar not only for Iraq, but for the entire region. And actually, if you look beyond the region, we're in deep need of strong political leadership around the world, including in this very country. So thank you for being you, thank you for being president, and thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you. Thank you.
Esteemed guests, please remain seated as we escort His Highness Dr. Barham Salih and his delegation out of the building.